Hello, this is the amazing story of Jesus in the Old Testament, a video series by me, Kristen Forster, on behalf of Jesus Centered. If you enjoy this video, then please like it and share it. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be kept informed of future releases.
So the Word became flesh and he dwelt among us. And as we saw in the last video in this series, when John the Gospel writer wrote those words, he was just making explicit what the ancient rabbis had already seen as they contemplated the meaning of Dabar Yahweh, the God Word, the Word of God, who was so much more than just a simple message that they gave him a special name. He was the Memra. But John takes it a step further. So the Word did become flesh and he did live with us, but then he tells us, we saw his glory, such glory as of the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. And then John goes on to tell us that no one's actually seen God the Father at any time, but that the one and only Son, who is right in the core of who the Father is, he has declared him or made him known. You see, there is a part of the uncreated triune creator that is so radically and gloriously different to anything that's created that it can't be directly understood by us. But fortunately, there is also a part of God that is the eternal consequence of his creatorhood. God's eternally begotten inner life, his thoughts, his word, his Son. Paradoxically, we can know the unknowable God, but only as Father, because he's revealed to us by the knowable part of God, the bit we can comprehend, his word, his Son, through Jesus. There's a truth here that's so profoundly elegant it could fry our heads a bit as we meditate on it for too long, and that's not actually my aim in this video. All I really wanted to establish was how some of the most stunning civilization-shaping insights have come to us by the clarity that Jesus brings to that puzzle that the ancient rabbis first struggled with as they thought hard about what exactly the Dabar Yahweh, or the Memra as they like to call him, really was. If you think about it, when God said, "Let there be light," there was no body and or no thing to do his command. God's word kind of carried by his breath or spirit into that formless emptiness that existed outside of himself. Well, that had to have enough life in and of itself to get the job of creation done. It was by musing on ideas like that that the ancient rabbis who lived before Jesus came to a sort of proto-trinitarian view. It wasn't yet the Father, Son and Holy Spirit of the New Testament, but it was only one step away. But before they could get to that kind of profound insight, these rabbis were going to need some words to meditate on. And as we noticed in the previous video, there was a problem, because when God the Word appeared to Abraham, he almost certainly couldn't read or write, because pretty much no one could in his day. Before God could be understood through his Word made flesh, people were going to need to get a little bit more practiced with words themselves, both in a day-to-day sense, but also, and more importantly perhaps, on an abstract level. You see, if you think about it, you can't really understood why it was that God revealed himself as the Aleph and the Tav, which in the New Testament becomes the Alpha and the Omega, the first and last letters of an alphabet, if in actual fact you don't actually know what an alphabet is. In Abraham's day, they hadn't been invented yet, which of course was going to create a problem, because his family were going to need to capture and record the oracles of God, the prophecies of what he was going to bring, so that we could understand Jesus when he came. So it seems that God gifted the Israelites with an alphabet while they were in Egypt, and that alphabet changed the whole world. When it comes to written language, it's actually true that both the Sumerians and the Egyptians had developed systems of writing as early as the 3rd millennia BC, but these were far too complex and symbolic for people like Abraham, although ironically they had actually been developed from the sort of trading systems that people like Abraham used to record business transactions. As Sumerian traders moved up and down the Fertile Crescent, they would mark quantities onto soft pieces of clay along with an image of the thing that they were perhaps trying to trade. Over time, these simple records were organised into much more complex tablets, and now the position and the arrangements of the original pictures started to convey more complex and abstract truth than just the simple idea of what was being traded and how much. Eventually, the Sumerians started using wedge-shaped reeds to create written testaments, and the Sumerian scribes replaced recognizable pictures with complex arrangements of those wedge shapes to create cuneiform, the world's first fully fledged writing system, which was shortly followed up by hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt. But in both these civilizations, the writing systems took a whole lifetime to learn, and they were the privilege of the priestly or perhaps governing castes. So while it's likely that Abraham knew enough to understand that he'd just paid for 5 chickens and not just a loaf of bread, he wasn't able to write his own biography or publish the book of Genesis. Now, it's useful to understand that both Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs did have a phonological component to their writing systems. That just means that there were things in their writing that would indicate how a word was said. So we do now have some idea how their words sounded. But those components were made up of whole syllables. It was like a cat, or a dog, or perhaps a log. And you could sometimes combine them to indicate a larger sound. So cat and log becomes catalogue. But nobody had thought of using a system where the writing was just made up of a small set of pictures or glyphs that represented the common consonantal sounds that were used to say a word. Now it turns out the first person to have that idea happened to speak ancient Hebrew, although he lived in Egypt. That might be a bit of a surprise, and many scholars would want to tell you that the precise Hebrew genius that came up with this radical idea, which is the world's first alphabet, was far too early to be a son of Jacob. Now, there's not time to go and explore all the tangled mess that makes up Egyptian chronology. We'll have to do that in a later video when we look at the Exodus. But here I will point out that one Egyptologist has called chronology of Egypt a rubber chronology because it has to be squeezed and pulled all of the time to fit in with its own known events outside of Egypt. So what we can say more confidently is that in a generation or so before this inspired Hebrew invented the world's first alphabet, Egypt just so happened to have a vizier with exactly the same name that the Bible tells us that Pharaoh gave to Joseph. In fact, one of the first things we ever found written in the world's first alphabet is the name Levi. It was discovered in the winter covering 1904 to 1905 by a couple of English archaeologists, Hilders and Flinders Petrie, near turquoise mines in Sinai at a location called Serabit al-Qadim. It was part of 40 or so inscriptions that seemed to use elements that were drawn from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but they were laid out in straight lines and nobody could read them because, of course, at the end of the day, they weren't actually written in Egyptian. It was only when another Egyptologist, a man called Alan Gardner, had the inspired idea of giving the symbols a sound value from the words that they described, and it was only when he then tried using Hebrew words that the words suddenly came alive and everything made sense. So let's be really clear here. The oldest words ever written down in the phonetic alphabet wrote sentences that were written in ancient Hebrew, and one of them was actually signed. Levi was here. Okay, just said Levi, but you know what I mean. These first ancient letters are now referred to as the proto-siniatic alphabet, and texts have now been found written in this alphabet all through Egypt proper. And the proto-siniatic alphabet is now understood to be the foundation alphabet for every modern phonetic alphabet in the world. So let's have a look at one of these texts. I thought I'd show you one that was translated in just the last few years by a guy called Rabbi Bar John. The picture shows you a part of the wall opposite mine L31 at Serabit al-Qadim, which is on the Dimofka plateau where the ancient Hebrew letters were first discovered. Actually, the Egyptian name Dimofka appears in the Bible, but there it's just Dofka, and it's the location where the people camp just after the first provision of manna in the book of Exodus, which is important to the text we're going to look at. You see, the characters, you can't see them, they're not easy to see, but if you look carefully, there they are. See, there's a vertical line of text, and there is actually a horizontal line, but for this video, I'm just going to look at the vertical line. You can see the ancient hieroglyphs appearing now, as I just draw them out for you. I'll pull out these ancient letterglyphs so they're easier to see, and then we'll write in their equivalent in terms of the biblical Hebrew letters. Now, you can actually say these words. They read Entosh Gan Dak Milav Bamanak, which is kind of a rhyming couplet, which is nice. But what's really interesting is what they mean. So that first line, Entosh Gan Dak, well, that reads, see, I root out or uproot a lowly or an oppressed or overturned garden. It seems to be a reference to Egypt, which in the ancient world was often referred to a garden due to its exceptionally fertile nature, which was caused by the annual Nile flood. So Egypt certainly had been brought low by the events of the Exodus, but what is really interesting is what comes next. Mi lav ba manak. Who is for the Father in regards to your manna? Or perhaps you could translate it if whoever is with the Father is with, i.e. they have, manna. The whole phrase seems to be an encouragement to respect the desert manna. It's linked to a reminder to the people of what's been happening in Egypt. If we were to put meaning into plain English, it would read something like, "See how I ploughed up the lowly vegetable garden of Egypt, and those who are with the Father are going to have manna." You remember that whole issue of being fed by manna and whether it was the equivalent of what they had in Egypt was a big contentious one for the children of Israel, just after they had received manna for the first time, just when they were in Dofka, which is Dumovka, which is by the Serabit el-Kadim mines. The strange thing is there are still history books that will tell you there is no historical evidence for the Exodus. Oh well, what can you do? But anyway, it seems that from the days of Moses onwards, Jacob's family could write using a letter system that was absolute child's play compared with the complex systems of Egypt and Samaria. Eventually we're going to find the ancient Hebrew alphabet written out in order on the walls of homes. Perhaps it was how they taught their children to read. Now, you'll have probably noticed that the letter shapes of the most ancient Hebrew alphabet don't look like the later biblical letters. They will evolve and change over the years, and what we think of as Hebrew letters today took shape while the Jews were in exile in Babylon. These original characters were often borrowed directly from the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and interestingly, many ancient Hebrew words embodied a hieroglyph or a symbolic connection to the words that they portrayed, as well as having a phonological connection to it. The way the word was written quite brilliantly created a picture that explained something of the very word it was representing. Now, if you take, for example, the word for father, which is ab, it's spelt with the Hebrew letters Aleph and Beth. Aleph can mean ox, among other things, and in that ancient Hebrew alphabet, that's exactly how the letter Aleph was represented, with a bull's head. But actually, Aleph itself can mean more things than just bull. It can also be a chieftain or a family head. But then, beyond what the character actually looked like, it actually came to mean something. It stood for the number 1, and it represented the concept of first. The second letter, Beth, was actually drawn from a picture that represented a house or a tent at different periods in Israel's history. So you put them together and the word father, Hebrew ab, is spelt with letters that show a picture of the first or the primary or the chief character in the household. So before we move on from that one, we should also notice that a bull was also a universal symbol for God in the ancient world, and although the Israelites weren't supposed to represent God, they often did, which is why whenever they did, they represented God with a golden calf or a bull. So it's not surprising when we look at the Hebrew word for God, El, to discover that actually its first letter is also an Aleph, the bull again representing something of that divinity that's part of the name. And the second letter in the word God, Lamed, is actually the 12th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, but don't forget that 12 is the Bible's number for the government or for leadership. Anyway, the Hebrew scribes actually noticed that Lamed sat right in the middle of their alphabet, and in fact more than that, if you took the sort of middle 3 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, they spelt a word themselves, Malak, which is the word for a king. And the middle letter of the word king, which is also the middle letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is the Lamed, which happens to be the only Hebrew letter that reaches up and above the normal text line. And so they referred to the Lamed as the King of Kings, because it's the tall letter in the word king, which is right there in the middle of the whole alphabet. But of course in the proto-siniatic alphabet it looked different from the way I've just shown it. It was actually a shepherd's crook. In fact, the later glyph still represents the crook, it's just not quite as obvious. And a shepherd's crook, of course, is how a shepherd guides a flock. So in pictogram form, the word for God creates a hieroglyph that shows the chief or the first or even the divine shepherd. Mix that with the idea that the Lamed is the King of Kings, and the pictogram could say that the divine shepherd is also the divine King of Kings. I could give you all sorts of other examples, but I want us to focus on that little word at that we've looked at in some of the other videos in this series. The at, which is made up of the first and last letters of the Hebrew alphabet and appears over 9,000 times on almost every page of your Old Testament. What does that look like as a pictogram? Well, the first letter is again an aleph, the bull's head, but the last letter, the tav, is drawn as two crossed sticks, and it was almost certainly borrowed from the hieroglyphic element which we know by the exact same name, the crossed sticks. And so to the ancient Hebrew mind, it showed the largest animal that you could sacrifice, a bull, being offered up now as a burnt offering over crisscrossed sticks. So Aleph Tav, 9,000 times, sacrifice breathed through every page of the Old Testament. Of course, with hindsight, we can see the relevance of the Aleph and Tav to Jesus, who declared himself to be the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega too, because he was, of course, the biggest possible sacrifice, and he was the true image of God, not just a fake image, the image that had first been represented by the bull, but he was now being offered up on a wooden cross. That little word, the Aleph Tab, was made flesh in Jesus. And finally, what about the name of God himself? God revealed himself to Moses at Sinai using the name Yahweh, made up of 4 letters from their brand new alphabet. Well, the first letter is a yod, and the word yod is derived from the name yad, which is a hand, and in fact the very first pictogram of the letter shows an arm and a hand. It's followed by a hey, which ironically does sort of mean, hey, look at this, in ancient Hebrew, and its picture actually shows a man with his hands raised either in surprise or possibly in praise. Perhaps, wow, look at this, captures something of its meaning. And then next to that there is a wav. Now wav means a hook or a peg, and both the biblical Hebrew letter glyph and the ancient Hebrew pictogram represent exactly that. But remember, ancient Hebrew words have a much broader meaning than their more precise modern languages, so wav actually covers the idea of both a tent peg or a nail or a stake as well. The last letter in Yahweh is another hey. Wow, it's a great crescendo at the end of the name. So the pictogram that you create from it, the hieroglyph that the name Yahweh represents, sort of conveys something of an idea expressed by Thomas after the resurrection. The picture reads, the hand, wow, look at this. The nail, wow, look at that. Or as Thomas expressed it, unless I can see his hands and the print of the nails and put my hands into his side, then I don't think I'll believe. Nobody has seen God, but the Son has made him known. And in this case, as Yahweh revealed that name to Moses, he gave him a name which in the letters that they were going to write with would become a testimony in its own right to the cross of Jesus Christ. If this all seems like just too much of a coincidence, then we just need to remind ourselves that God does seem to love wordplay and even number play. If you go to the very last book of the entire Bible, the book of Revelation, then the author John has added up the numeric value of the name Nero Caesar when said in Hebrew. It comes out to the number 666, and he uses it as a coded reference. But what John would have been aware of, but he just doesn't say explicitly to us, is if you take the name Jesus and you spell it in Greek, it comes out as the number 888. It's a trinity of 8s rather than a trinity of 6s. But beyond that, the number 888 had some spiritual significance in the Greek system of turning names into numbers. You see, the Greek alphabet is made up of 24 letters, and the way you get numbers from them is by breaking it into 3 groups of 8. So the number 888, which is the sum of Jesus' name when said in Greek, actually represents the entire Greek alphabet. Jesus was the Aleph Tav in the Old Testament, and he's Jesus, the entire Greek alphabet which wrote the New Testament. He is the sum of everything that God has to say to humanity. He is the Word.